Hello guys, today I thought I would go over how to use OBS, Open Broadcast Software. This, if you don't already know, is a software that you can use for streaming and recording primarily, as well as some other things such as converting video files into different container formats. So we're going to start out really simple today, and then we're going to get more complicated as we go deeper into the video. So starting from square one, OBS, Open Broadcast Software. I've already told you what it is. Now let's take a look at it. So this is something like what your OBS will look like when you start it up. However, you won't have an active recording going, nor will all of these things be set. But the theme should generally be the same. This is the default theme OBS ships with these days. Do make sure that when you install OBS off of their website, if you decide to get it, that you get the newest OBS. Do not dig deeper to find the classic one. It will not function nearly as well by today's standards. Up top, we just have some information on its OBS. This is the version it is. It's showing our profile. I can load up profiles to change everything that you see here. I could customize profiles and save them. Right here, we have our preview. This is showing us what we will be capturing if we were to stream or record the current image. Right here, we have our scenes. This is the starting category, and we have sources under that. A scene is more just a customization category that you can set up in order to organize your sources. One easy way to make a new scene is to just press the plus button down here. You can name it, and then you can start customizing it for whatever you want after that. I've named this one Record because I use it for recording. I can also click this little trash can icon if I wish to delete my current scene. There's other things here like filters, which usually you're going to handle not on a scene by scene basis, but you might. That's how you do it. You can organize it by moving it up or moving it down. If you expand this from side to side, then you would not need to click that little icon like I did. But you can also just right click things to get a bunch of options for them. You could duplicate a scene and everything in it. You could remove it here like so. As you see, there's also hotkeys for doing things. Here's where you can rename it if you so choose. And if you do wish to move it, you don't even need to do it like this. You can just drag it around. So I could drag it, say, right there. It is now above my goodbye, and now it is below my goodbye. Once you have your scene picked out, you want to go to your sources. Now, there's a bunch of different kinds of sources. You see the controls here, pretty much the same. If we add a source, though, we're not just naming it. We're picking it from a list of options. So for example, if we want to have just a static image, we'd pick this. If we wanted an image slideshow, we'd pick this. We get to input multiple images. We could add a media source. So for example, if I wanted a song to play every time I opened this scene, then it would play from this source. I would select it and it would just play back. It's not just songs, it's any media source you could put in. Browser sources, if you plan on using something like Streamlabs, you would usually link a browser in here. Or if you plan on having your chat display on screen, you might need the actual chat pop out browser link, put it in right there. Let's say you're trying to stream or record a game. There may be 3 different options you pick. Game capture will search for the executable and what it is outputting, and then you'd get to select it here. I'll show you that in a moment. Windows capture would actually just capture one full window. So for example, the entire monitor, this is on, and it would just output whatever's coming through to that feed. And display capture is sort of like that, although it's not just going to be showing what's coming in on the forefront of that feed. Literally everything will pop up here. And so this is how I like to do it. I like to go for game capture first. If I'm recording a game, for example, it can detect the exe. Nothing else that is irrelevant. There are some settings to customize further. We'll look at those in a little bit. But game capture, it just works the best. It's the most convenient, and no pop-ups will be shown if they come through to your desktop. Window capture sometimes can be good at avoiding pop-ups. I'd only use this really as an alternative to game capture, or if there's more on the screen that I want to show. However, when dealing with games, some pop-ups in games will not, like UI elements, for example, sometimes they're not displayed with window capture, in which case I need display capture, which will just display everything on the screen. This is just the best fallback if your game cannot be detected. If you're having some UI problems with window capture, display capture will show everything. This is my examples, I will tell you about how these sources work. Now, if we right click on recording, we could look at some further details. The first thing you have to select is your mode. It will default to capture any full screen application. Personally, I don't like that because I have a lot of applications open at once. I pick capture specific window, and then I select what window I want to. You can also just capture foreground window with a hotkey. I don't need to use this, by the way. I could just click it, and then the information of any selected source will be right here. So I can change the modes here. I can change the window here. And I can also apply filters, and this is how I would really apply filters, on a source by source basis, not on a scene by scene basis. And I can access properties through here as well. If you're having trouble detecting whatever you're trying to detect, there's window match priority. You have some options here you could try to cycle through, but default should usually work. There's a bunch of extra options here. Capture audio beta right now. This will just generate automatically an audio capture source, which was in that list that I showed you a moment ago. And this is only really useful if you're not using the default audio mixing settings, which most of you will be, so you could probably ignore that. There's SLI crossfire capture mode. This is if you're using 2 graphics cards at once. If you're trying to capture an image, the likelihood of you needing to use this is extremely low. A lot of motherboards today don't even allow you to use crossfire or SLI anymore, so this is mostly a legacy feature, I would say. You can limit the capture frame rate artificially through the recording separate to the actual settings, which we will be going over. You could toggle whether or not you want to capture third-party overlays, and there are a couple of other things that I wouldn't really change if I was you, unless it specifically meets your needs, allowing transparency, and this are options that you will know if you need them, but you probably don't need them. Now, over here, we have our display record, and we see the options are far simpler. You could force standard definition in case there is an HDR input going on. For example, in a video game could be useful. You could select what monitor you want to capture. You could select specifically how you want to capture. You can probably just leave that to automatic just fine. There is also the Windows recording, which is a little bit different. Like I said, this can capture what's on the foreground of your monitor. So in this case, for example, we can select an application just like we can select it with the recording. And the options are very similar, but you have less total options, as we can see. You know, capture cursor, that's very standard one. Do you want to see the cursor? But like I mentioned, this is more an alternative, I'd say, for a game capture. And it can result in problems with anything that's any kind of pop-out UI element or any kind of plugin, because, again, it's just trying to capture the foreground of the monitor, as I mentioned. And those are our sources, and that's generally how they work. There are more complicated sources that you can look into, and they have way more customization options, but I feel like you know how they work at the very least right now. Next, we have our audio mixer. Any audio inputs that you set up in your settings, which we will go over, will appear here. You can apply filters to these as well. This is where, for example, if you have a microphone, you can apply noise suppression and a noise gate. If you're not already doing that in a separate program, it offers a couple of options that you could customize to your likings. I'm not going to teach you how audio mixing works here. Just note that this is where you would access that stuff. There's some properties if you need to specify your audio device, as well as some advanced audio properties that are pretty darn useful, I must say, especially if you're using OBS for recording and for streaming, because you can set up different tracks and set recording and streaming to identify different tracks. For example, I have my desktop audio set for track 1 and 3. Mic is on 2 and 3. You can ignore recording because we did not make a separate audio source for it, so it's just going to be using these two here. The reason this is like this is because I'm splitting my tracks, so I have 2 different audio tracks in every video file I generate. Track 1 has desktop audio, track 2 has microphone audio, track 3 is my stream audio, and so I have both of them on that track. I'll show you more about that in the settings as we go on. Scene transitions over here. This is just if I swap between scenes here, how do you want it to go? Do you want it to just cut, or do you want it to fade into that, and how long do you want the transition to be? This is how you would set that up. Up at the top here, we have the help button if you need any help with OBS, like accessing log files, crash reports, visiting their website, finding information about the program. This is where you would look. Tools here I would call more advanced. You can set up an automatic scene switcher, basically switch or don't switch when conditions are met. That is a way to just auto go through different scenes if you have a use case for it. Output timer, this can have you stop streaming or recording after a certain period of time, as well as setting some certain other parameters. Again, mostly more advanced stuff. Setting your own script add-ons, most users are not going to use this. You can run experimental caption generation using a language and text provider, speech to text provider, in case you want some more accessibility for your recording or stream and don't have or know any other way to do it. And moving on to scene collection, this is where you would have those profiles I mentioned earlier. So all these settings I've set up, I could then save them, make it a profile. I can import profiles, export profiles, duplicate profiles, as well as check for any missing files in my profile. And then I can swap between these. I can't because I'm recording right now, but if I wasn't recording, then I could just swap between profiles there. Docs are for customizing your UI. This is just the UI customization button. Essentially, I can pull things out based on what I'm using. For example, a integrated chat. If I want to read the chat, this won't actually display the chat. This is to read the chat. A control panel, if I want to have it in OBS instead of having it up separate, as well as statistics. These are all just linked to my live streaming, whereas this is all the crap you're seeing down here at the bottom. View, if you want to change how the UI actually looks without, you know, customizing all these little docs. That's what these little symbols are here, by the way. It means that it's a doc. You can actually pull it out and move it around and customize your view. You can have a multi-view across multi-monitor in full screen or windowed formats. Edit, if you wish to look at transforming things that are on your screen right here, as well as scaling and such like that, which, by the way, if you do have multiple things on the screen here, you can right click them as well, and then you would get access to transforming them and other things. If you need to scale something, for example, to be centered to the screen, to be the actual same size as the screen, it provides a bunch of little options like that. And then files, you can see all your recordings where they go. This will just bring you to your default output. If you know where it is, then you don't necessarily need this. This will bring you to settings. We know where the settings are, and this will show you where you store your profiles and settings files. And you can remux recordings. This is a little handy tool. Basically, remuxing is to take a video file. For example, if I have a .mkv, I could turn it into a .mp4. You know, MP4 is the most common thing you would be using, but OBS's remux tool is specifically useful for turning something into an MP4, especially because you would have very valid reasons to actually do that. For example, if you record in an MP4, you could lose everything if you have a power outage or OBS crashes, because if you can't sign off the metadata at the end of an MP4, the entire video container is now corrupted. A .mkv, for example, does not have that problem, and we'll go over that a little bit more as we get into the settings. Speaking of which, let's look at the final things here, the controls. So, assuming you're actually linked to start a stream, you will see something like this: start streaming, potentially manage broadcast if the website you're streaming to supports this, start, stop recording, pause if you're using a form of recording that allows you to pause recordings. We'll look at that in the settings. Start virtual camera. This is especially useful if you want to essentially use OBS as a camera for a different application. Don't know if you'd really have that use case. Studio mode will actually just transform all of this, so I'm not going to press this right now. Settings, this is where we're going to get into the nitty gritty. So if this theme is not up to your likings, you can actually change it here. So oh God, you can flashbang yourself. You can go to the dark theme. This is like the classic dark theme before they made Yami the default. The light, more flashbangs. You got Rachni. These are just the ones that ship here in terms of options. I just usually stick with the default. It's got a nice contrast to it. You can set a bunch of things here like hiding OBS windows from screen capture. Can be especially useful if you don't want to show OBS windows on your actual screen capture. You can set how you want to update your OBS. If you have access to betas, then you can go ahead and opt in for betas. This stuff is a more niche case though. This is pretty handy right here for the output. So if you don't want to accidentally start a stream while trying to start a recording, you can have a confirmation dialog for that. If you don't want to accidentally stop a stream or a recording, you can have confirmation dialogues for those. You can automatically set recording to start the moment that you start streaming. That's useful if you record your streams at the same time. And we'll talk more about how that works as we go into it. Then the rest of this is mostly just customizing all the customization tools themselves when you're actually adjusting your scene. For example, snapping different windows to each other on the scene. And there's also something like enabling OBS being on your system tray down here and minimizing to system tray and always minimizing instead of putting it on the taskbar proper. There's a lot of things like that, but we're going to move on to stream. Now, when you are setting up a stream, you need to first select your service. So for example, you might stream to YouTube like I do currently, and you'll see two default options here, YouTube RTMPS, YouTube HLS. If you don't see your option, just press show all down here. This will be the actual ingest that you're using to stream to a location. What is an ingest? An ingest is just kind of like the protocol that you're using to stream to something. So for example, RTMPS is technically based in Flash. This is the most common way to do live streams. If you stream to something like Twitch, you don't see an option for RTMPS or HLS or anything else because it's just using RTMPS by default. This is the best for near zero latency. However, if you have a bad connection, it's not a very good option. HLS is my preferred way to stream. This is a more popular way to output video, where instead of sending a constant data stream that requires a stable, very stable internet to actually download, HLS will handle it in chunks, maybe 5 seconds worth of chunks at a time, and then ship them out and then send them to the viewer, things like that. This is, once again, more use case. Just find whatever you're streaming to and then you're good. There's some very interesting options on that list, and I won't judge you if you're doing it. You can connect an account, so you can just log directly in to whatever service that you are trying to stream to. So on Twitch and YouTube, for example, you just log in with your normal account, it will link it, and then that's it. You don't need to do anything else. If you don't want to give OBS this ability to log in for whatever reason, then your streaming service will provide you a stream key that you would input here in place of this. You can ignore streaming service settings recommendations. That's what these are right here. For example, YouTube has a very large range of audio bitrate and video bitrate that they allow you to send out to them. Every streaming service will have different settings that they actually accept. A big distinction between YouTube and Twitch, for example, is that YouTube allows pretty high video intakes because they allow you to stream in 4K. Twitch does not provide anywhere near this amount. Inversely, Twitch will actually take a much larger audio bitrate than this, whereas YouTube limits it to this. Now, you could still record stream at higher than this. It's just that if you're streaming it out, YouTube's not going to take this. And if you select this, then you're ignoring the recommendations. It will refrain from overriding your settings to meet these requirements. So for example, if I have it set to 256 kilobits for audio, and then I stream to YouTube, if I select this, it'll still send that out, whether YouTube actually allows it or not. And then if I don't have this selected, it will just adjust the source to match, pretty much. So this is a very special use case sort of thing. You're not really going to need to ignore, but do take your streaming services maximums into account when you decide what to make your stream. And figuring out what to make your stream is done on the output, video, and to a lesser extent audio tabs. Now, because I'm recording with OBS, I can't show you everything here, but let's just look at this stuff. We are in the advanced mode. By default, you will be in the basic mode, which will kind of lump streaming and recording together, and it'll allow you to set stuff like your bitrate in the simple mode, and then recording it will be very generic with. It will ask you if you want to use same settings as stream, or it'll ask you if you want certain levels of quality. It's the simplest way to do it, but it doesn't allow for a lot of control, and you could still make simple things with this layout here. So I would recommend just using the advanced, whether you know what most of these things mean or not, because still the most important things are automated for you. Earlier, I showed you how to set up your advanced audio tracks. Well, this is where you select it. As streaming, I have number 3 selected. You could change your audio encoder. AAC is the default. In most cases, this will be what you use. Video encoder, you'll have a list of options here, such as Havoc H.265, AVC H.264. If it has an X for X.264 or something, that's CPU encoded, so your CPU will be doing the heavy lifting. And H, like H.264, H.265, generally these options will have AMD or NVIDIA, NVENC, for example, right next to it. This will use an onboard encoder on your graphics card that will vastly reduce the impact on your gaming. This is not putting the work on the GPU proper. The encoder is a separate chip that will do a vast majority of the work. You see, OBS is only using like 0.1 to 0.2% of my CPU right now. If I was using a CPU encoder, then OBS would be using a lot more. Depending on my settings, it would be using 17%, 20%. You can see how that could be a problem really quickly on something like gaming performance or any application performance that needs this. There's other options as well, like AV1, and for that, it's just really what your hardware supports, what you want to run, and whether or not you're using a capture card, which you would have figured out before getting to a tutorial like this. You can rescale output right here. I don't recommend using this, like, ever, if you're doing a gaming stream or something, because this is a CPU rescaling option, which will be more demanding on the CPU. There is a GPU rescaling option. And what is rescaling? Rescaling is, let's say you're streaming at 2K, for example, or 4K, but you don't have the capability to stream that for whatever reason. Let's say you're using Twitch, which just doesn't support the bitrate, or you're using YouTube, but your internet doesn't support the bitrate. Then you want to rescale the output down to 1080p or 720p, for example. Well, this is where you would set that if you want to use the CPU rescaler, but there is one in video that I'll point out again when we get there that you would more ideally use. Then for the encoder settings, you choose how you want to send out your stream. I'm amazed it lets me change this, but not this. It used to let me preview this, it doesn't anymore. If you're streaming, always use CBR. Basically, every streaming everything will basically demand CBR, because CBR sets out a specified bit rate, which we'll talk about in a second, that doesn't really change very much. It's very easy to watch on the viewer's end. All the other options like to adjust bit rate to the quality. So for example, with nothing going on the screen right now, it would like to adjust something like that to a very low bitrate. Now, let's say I'm in a video game and then I start moving, then it might adjust to an extremely high bitrate. This sort of thing can definitely overload a viewer's experience, and thus it would cause them to buffer, hence why CBR is basically enforced on just about every streaming service that is relevant. Keyframes, if you want to actually set that auto, if you just want to let OBS handle that. What is a keyframe? A keyframe is a reference frame. Basically, there's a lot of different kinds of reference frames, but a keyframe will be clearer than frames in motion. That is the simple explanation I will give to this. Preset, this and all these things down here will depend on what encoder you're using for what you will see. If you're using a GPU encoder, generally quality is the way to go. The other ways are good for if your encoder gets overloaded with what you're doing. If that's a problem, then you can lower to balance or fast, for example, if you want to be able to avoid encoder overloads. If you're using a CPU encoder, then it's really just up to what your CPU can handle and what's producing an output image, as well as game FPS if you're using gaming that you're happy with. And now bitrate. What is bitrate? Bitrate keeps coming up, right? For audio and video, bitrate is what determines the quality of your video. There is a common misconception that I've seen on those just getting into certain things like streaming and recording, where they think resolution is everything. They think, oh man, I need to stream at 4K because it looks great. Well, you can't stream at 4K. It doesn't work like that, because you need to send out bits to actually make the image look good. Whenever a scene is in motion, then that scene, especially, it's not as big of a deal if it's a static image. that scene will need a lot of data, a bit rate of data, in order to adjust every single pixel on the screen to be seamless. For example, the higher the bit rate and the more advanced the encoder, then the better image quality you can achieve. Different resolutions need different bit rates. So whereas 720p and lower can suffice with, say, 4 megabits and lower all the way up to 60 FPS, really, although 720p 60 FPS I guess would be more ideal at like 6 megabits, which would be 6,000 kilobits, which is how you input bit rate here. 1080p and above is where you need more. Now, every streaming service will provide you a list of recommendations of what you want to send them. This goes for recording as well, by the way. So on Twitch, last I checked, they limit you to 6 megabits total. And so for 1080p 30 FPS or anything above, you have to do 6 megabits. Now for anything above 1080p 30 FPS or 720p 60 FPS, that would look pretty fucking shoddy, and I wouldn't really recommend it. YouTube takes up to 10 megabits for 1080p 30 FPS if you're using H.264 or X.264. If you're using AV1 or H.265, then it will take 8 megabits for that, up to 8. And so somewhere between 5 to 8 would be good for a pretty good image quality, I would say, in that range, assuming you're using H.265 or you're using AV1. If you're using H.264, you need more, because H.264 is just a really ancient encoder. And again, you're gonna have to look at your particular streaming service and look at your internet speed. You know, your internet speed, it gives it in a bit rate. That's what this is. When we hop over to recording, things become simpler. There's a lot more things on the screen, but don't worry about it. Simpler in terms of those settings, you know. Usually you don't want to use CBR in terms of recording. I just standardize everything into CBR. It's your choice if you want to be like me. CBR can result in using a lot more space. For example, I've been recording this guide for almost 40 minutes at a constant 14 megabits. That's a lot of space that I could be saving on if I'm using other options like CQP and VBRs. Variable bitrate is what that stands for. But this is set up exactly like the streaming stuff. If you're using the simple options, you can just do same as stream. If you're recording your streams, honestly, I'd recommend doing same as stream, because then you won't be putting additional stress on your encoder by generating an entire another encoding. For recording settings here, you put an output folder that you want all recordings to go into. You pick a recording format. Like I mentioned earlier, MP4 may be the default, but I wouldn't recommend it because it can corrupt very easily. I'd recommend using that Remux feature and recording in MKV. MKV is high quality. There's no limitations. It just may be hard to edit. Even all the newest editing softwares, they don't work very well with MKV, but at the same time, they don't work very well with variable frame rate things, which is what MKV records into, so experiment with different recording formats, but please don't record in MP4. You might hate your life because it might lose you everything if you're doing long recordings like this. Select your video encoder again, the relevant audio tracks. For example, there's a CPU rescaler here as well. Oh, good God, if you were doing a stream and a recording and 3 different rescales, it would be awful. Try to stick to the video rescaler when we get to that in the video. You can do automatic file splitting. This is the old school way of avoiding corrupted recordings. So split by time, for example, automatic file splitting, you would check this and then set it to stop recording and start again, essentially, every input period of time here that you set. Go to audio, you could set the audio bit rates for every single track that you want. Going into audio settings here, you set your sample rate. This is important for the quality here. 44.1 or whatever, and 48, I wish I could click it and see, are generally the ones you want to stick to. Stereo or surround sound, depending on what you're using. You could set your audio devices, and that will determine what is appearing down here, or just flat out disable them. You could change how these audio meters work, so like a fast decay rate or slow or medium, for example, and a peak meter type, sample peak and true peak. True peak is a more accurate representation of how your audio is, but it uses more CPU. Sample peak is just how it looks here. Really, unless you're always constantly monitoring it, then there's hardly a reason to use the higher quality version, but you know, it's up to you. Your viewers are not going to be seeing that, only you're going to be seeing that. You could set a audio monitoring device if you want to put OBS audio and output it to another source so that you can monitor it somehow, for example, through monitors. You can also disable Windows audio ducking. That is basically like if you start up a voice call, then Windows may lower the sound of everything else. This would stop that, for example. And then the rest of this is just setting up a bunch of hotkeys, which is pretty self-explanatory. Videos. This is the more important way you want to set resolutions. So your base canvas resolution, this should be the area that you are recording. So if you're recording the whole size of your monitor and you're recording in 1080p, make sure this is 1920 by 1080p. If you're recording in 2K, make sure this is 25 whatever the fuck by 1440p. If you're recording in 4K, make sure this is 3800 whatever the fuck by whatever the fuck 4K is. I don't actually know the resolution and I don't care. Output scaled resolution. This is what you're actually scaling the image to. This is what will actually be output, not what the canvas is. The canvas just sets up how everything scales first into the recording. The output is what actually gets essentially converted into the recording. So for example, I could be at 2K or 4K, but only output in 1080p or 720p if I have a 1080p monitor. This is very common on Twitch due to Twitch's very limiting bitrate settings. You would have a 1080p monitor, but you would output into 720p, for example. And then if you are scaling, you would have to use a downscale filter, and you would get a whole bunch of options that I cannot show you right now, sadly. But it'll have options such as bilinear and bicubic. Bilinear is the fastest way to do downscaling. It's the least demanding on whatever you're using as an encoder and or your CPU. And then there's bicubic, which is better, and this is probably what you should be using is bicubic. And then there's one that's even a step above that, that is just getting into like video file territory that the average viewer is not really going to notice, and it'll be way more demanding. Lancos, I think it's called. You could set your FPS that you wish to actually output in. Common values would be 29.97, 30, 59.94, 60, 25, 24. There's a bunch of different ones like that. Probably the standard thing you'll be outputting is 30 or 60. You can use 29.97, 59.94. Although if you plan on editing and rendering, I found that just 30 and 60 are better overall for fast rendering. The extra data there can result in a lot of work that goes into 29.97. You're not saving 0.03 FPS, just so you know. You're not saving 0.06 and like saving on, that's extra color information that's only really important for analog, you know, TV broadcasts, things like that. For digital media, it doesn't matter. If you're recording in OBS, you're recording in digital media. So I'd stick with a flat number like 30 or 60 unless you know what you're doing and you know that you need something that is not those. You can then set up a bunch of hotkeys for starting streaming, stopping streaming, etc., etc. There's accessibility settings specifically for colors and audio here. And then there's advanced settings here. If you have trouble with encoder overloads when gaming, you might be tempted to try raising the process priority. I would recommend actually not trying that at all. Just run OBS as an administrator. I had that problem myself for a long time, and it's just because a game might demand access to your GPU before OBS, and if a game is using basically all of your GPU, then OBS isn't going to get enough of your GPU. And that can be a problem. Run it as an administrator. Do not run your game as an administrator, ideally. And you're saying to Windows, hey, give OBS what it wants first, give everything else after. So that's what I would do. Show active output warning on exit. This is just a pop-up that will say, hey, you're recording or streaming. Are you sure you want to exit the program? Making sure you could stop things properly. You could set video things. I wouldn't mess with any of this unless you're using HDR or you know that you need this for some other reasons. The default settings are good and they will work for the average consumer, the average streamer, the average person making videos will work just fine with this. If you already know what all these settings are and you know what you need, then you don't need me to explain how this works. If you don't know what any of this is, then just leave it alone. Recording, you can format your file type. So for example, I have every recording oh God, yes. So there's a tooltip that will tell you what it all means, but I have mine set to month as a decimal number, day, and then basically the year, and then in minutes and seconds, for example. That's how I have my output formatted. But you don't really need to use this at all, like this code. You could just type in completely random shit. You can set it to overwrite if a file matching the same parameters exists, so that's why you might just want to use the code anyway, depending. And you can have it automatically remux to MP4. For example, you hit stop recording if you've picked .mkv as your container, and it'll turn into an MP4 container instead. There's no quality lost in this process. MP4 is just more compatible, and I would recommend going through this unless variable frame rate causes you a problem. Then I would seek a different solution. Then you can also add a stream delay artificially on OBS's side. So for example, this would just record some extra information when you're streaming and then send it out, for example, at a 20-second delay or later. And then it will preserve the cutoff point and thus increase delay when reconnecting. That's if you lose connection to your stream, for example. You can set it to automatically reconnect if you lose connection to your stream, how often it can try, and the maximum amount of times that it can retry. This is good if you have a little tiny internet outage that goes away very quickly. Depending on what you have selected, you might have a streaming protocol. For example, in RTMP H.264, you would be able to enable certain features here that I cannot enable with my settings that would allow you to automatically change your bitrate midstream. I cannot do that, but you would find the settings to set that up here. Sources, you can enable browser source hardware acceleration. This is basically just saying if you put a browser source like I showed earlier, then you will be able to use your GPU to process anything coming from there. Very useful if that browser source has some sort of video attached. All right, and that's most of it. There's a little bit of UI down here. If you're streaming, you'll see how long you were streaming. You'll see your bitrate connection, how many bits are being sent out every second or so. And you'll have the length of a recording if you're actively recording. If I pause the recording, it'll go yellow and show pause, the CPU being consumed, and the FPS that we are working with. That is not everything to OBS, but that's a lot of how OBS works, taken in a sort of linear order. Hopefully it has been helpful to you learning how this program works and making it suit your needs. This is way more complicated and in-depth than the tutorial that I made in like 2018, 6 years ago, which is located in this playlist. I was not as good at this stuff 6 years ago, but if you want a shorter version of this that doesn't include everything that I went over, then you could look at that. Just warning, I was not as good at audio mixing either, so it will sound notably worse. But again, hope this has been helpful to you, and if you want to see any more guides or tutorials on creator style stuff like this, for example, I think I'll make one on Vegas Pro sometime soon. We'll see. Then make sure to leave it in the comments below. If you have any other questions that I might be able to help you with, leave that in the comments below as well. For now, though, thank you guys very much for watching, and I hope to see you on another video.